Hi, everybody. Tonight we begin a journey into the velvet-draped corridors of medieval power, where candlelight flickers over stone walls and secrets slumber beneath jeweled crowns. Our story, Shocking Royal Deaths in Medieval Times, will take us deep into the lives and ends of kings and queens, princes and dukes, whose destinies unraveled not always on the battlefield, but within shadows, silk, and sometimes even supper. It is a tale of power and peril, of courtly intrigue and whispered betrayals, told gently with care, like a lullaby stitched in velvet. Each life we'll encounter was adorned with ceremony and cloaked in legend, yet each came to an end both haunting and strangely intimate. And so we begin with a monarch whose death echoed not with the clash of swords, but the silence of solitude. In the year of our Lord, 1327, under a gray English sky heavy with the musk of autumn, the sun set on the reign of Edward II. His was a life both gilded and grievous, marked by splendor and sorrow. A king born to a throne yet unsuited to its demands, Edward had ruled not with wisdom or warlike valor, but with a heart given too easily and a will too stubborn to bend. His court shimmered with feasts and finery, but behind its rich tapestries discord festered. Edward had a fondness for favorites, men he trusted beyond all counsel, and in particular, one Piers Gaveston, whose easy laughter and unrestrained influence drew the ire of the barons like moths to an open flame. Their friendship, some whispered, was far more than camaraderie. The nobility saw it as an insult, the clergy as a sin, and the realm as a scandal. And so Piers met a brutal fate, executed by his enemies while the king wept powerlessly. This loss etched a mark into Edward's spirit. He would never again reign with ease. Years passed, and the realm grew restless. Queen Isabella, once a radiant gem in Edward's crown, now glimmered with something sharper, resolve. She had watched as England's fortunes withered under her husband's gaze. The French princess had come to despise the very man she once swore to honor, and in her heart, rebellion began to bloom. With her lover, the ambitious Roger Mortimer, she forged a silent campaign from afar. When she returned to England, it was not in soft silks, but in steel. Edward was dethroned in a quiet, calculated coup, and his son, the boy who would be Edward III, was crowned in his stead. But Edward II did not die then. No, that would have been too simple. He was taken to Berkeley Castle, a stone fortress nestled in the lush Gloucestershire countryside. And there, far from the grandeur of Westminster, he vanished into history, alive, yet entirely erased. They called it imprisonment, but it was more like disappearance. He was watched over, spoken to only as required, and sealed away from the world like a secret the realm dared not utter aloud. The question of his death is a mystery tangled in the ivy of rumor and the shadows of treachery. The chronicle most remembered tells of a dreadful act, of a red-hot poker, of agonies never spoken aloud, of screams muffled by thick castle walls. It is said that to leave no visible mark upon the king's body, his murderers chose a path more horrifying than the sword. Yet no official report confirmed it, only whispers. Years later, a letter was uncovered, its authenticity debated, its content chilling. In it, the death of Edward II was described not with ceremony, but with satisfaction. Edward of Caernarfon, your late lord, it read, has met his end, and none shall mourn him. But some did mourn. The people, even those who reviled his reign, felt a shudder in the spine of their kingdom. For kings were meant to fall in battle or die in their beds with bishops and banners beside them, not vanish behind stone and scream in silence. His son, Edward III, would grow to be a fierce ruler, a warrior king, but he never forgave the men who had engineered his father's death. In time, he would bring down Mortimer and imprison Isabella, sealing the tale with poetic justice only history could script. And yet still, some tales say Edward did not die at Berkeley, that he escaped, fled to the continent, lived out his days in quiet exile. There were sightings, wild rumors of a monk in Italy, a man with sad eyes who bore a crownless dignity. Could he have lived? Could the once and fallen king have found peace away from all he had lost? We cannot know, but we do know this. The death of Edward II, whether in fire or in flight, set a tone for the century to come. It taught the realm that royalty could bleed, could vanish, could be unmade not by armies, but by those who once pledged loyalty. His end, hidden, horrific, or hushed, reminds us that medieval crowns were not merely symbols of glory, but targets for vengeance and ambition. So we leave Edward now, alone in his dark chamber, the candlelight flickering low. The cold stone beneath him does not judge, and in the stillness, one can almost hear his sigh echo off the walls, regretful, resigned, and forever lost to time. In the silent corridors of time, where echoes of kings linger like faded hymns, we turn now to another chapter, one cloaked not only in tragedy, but in the peculiar stillness that follows an unexpected death. This is the story of a young king whose reign was measured in breaths, not battles. A monarch who never ruled, yet whose death sparked a quiet dread among his people. His name was Edward Vythe. The year was 1483. England, weary from decades of civil strife, the long and bloody contest known as the Wars of the Roses, looked toward a season of calm. The throne had recently belonged to Edward IV, a king of fierce charisma and battle-earned legitimacy. His court was lavish, his tastes bold, and his alliances carefully woven, but death does not heed crowns or lineage. When Edward IV died suddenly at the age of 40, the realm found itself not in mourning, but in a breathless pause. His heir, Edward Fyfe, was just 12 years old. He had been raised at Ludlow Castle, a place more tranquil than regal, under the watchful eye of his uncle Anthony Woodville, a cultured and devout nobleman. Edward, by all accounts, was intelligent, earnest, and perhaps too gentle for the thorns of kingship. When the news came that his father was dead, he was summoned to London for his coronation. He never arrived. It began with a change in guardianship. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle and younger brother to the late king, stepped forward as Lord Protector. He was known for his austere manners, his piety, and his loyalty to the Yorkist cause. But even loyalty, when tangled with ambition, can become a blade. As young Edward journeyed toward the capital, he was intercepted by Richard. Under the guise of protection, Richard dismissed Edward's loyal companions and took custody of the boy himself. The news reached London in ripples. The prince would now reside in the Tower of London, a tradition for monarchs before coronation. It was, at first, no cause for alarm. He was joined shortly thereafter by his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, just 9 years old. The two boys were housed in royal apartments, their presence reported with ceremony and occasional glimpses from the tower windows. Days turned into weeks. The coronation was postponed, then postponed again. Whispers began to drift through the alleys and alehouses, of illegitimacy, of plots, of something dark unfolding behind the fortress walls. Richard of Gloucester soon declared that his nephews were illegitimate, the product of a false marriage between Edward IV and their mother, Elizabeth Woodville. A sermon was preached in public, citing secret pre-contracts and immoral unions. And within days, Richard assumed the throne as Richard III. The boys were never seen again. No proclamation was made, no funeral held, no mourning clothes distributed, only silence. For centuries, their fate has remained one of England's most enduring mysteries. The princes in the tower, they were called, innocent and young, with faces captured in portraits far too solemn for their years. Many believed Richard III had them murdered to secure his rule. Some insisted it was the work of a rogue noble seeking favor. Others, still, clung to hope that the boys had been smuggled away in secret and raised in foreign lands. Years later, a man claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury would rally support in Europe, only to be captured and executed. Was he truly the younger prince, returned from exile, or merely a pretender drawn by legend? In the year 1674, beneath a staircase in the Tower of London, two small skeletons were discovered. They were hurriedly interred in Westminster Abbey under a stone that reads simply, "These were the bones of Edward Fyfe and Richard, Duke of York." Yet science had not confirmed the truth. To this day, they rest in silence, perhaps the only peace they have ever known. Richard III's reign would be short and bitter. He died on Bosworth Field, crying out for a horse, his crown lost in the mud. Henry Tudor took the throne and married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses. A new age dawned, and the mystery of the missing princes slipped quietly beneath the velvet of history. But in quiet corners of England, near the tower's ancient stones, one can still sense their presence. The footsteps that do not echo, the laughter that never came, the coronation that never bloomed. They were never kings, and yet they are remembered as royals, more in their absence than they ever were in life. Their story is not one of grandeur or conquest, but of innocence caught in the tide of ambition, swept away by currents too deep for such small souls. So we leave them now, the two princes, perhaps hand in hand, their eyes turned toward the sky beyond the tower windows. May their story be a lullaby for those who dream of justice and a whisper against the silence of forgotten graves. In the dark tapestry of royal history, there are deaths that feel more like silence than screams, quiet vanishments that unravel the soul of a nation. The tale that follows is one of such vanishing, where neither sword nor sickness claim the crown, but a slow unraveling of spirit, of isolation, and of betrayal that bloomed like frost across the stones of a Scottish castle. This is the death of Mary, Queen of Scots. Born in December of 1542 at Linlithgow Palace, Mary was thrust into sovereignty before she had even opened her eyes to the world. Her father, King James I of Scotland, died mere days after her birth, and thus Mary became queen as an infant swaddled in silks and uncertainty. From the very beginning, her life was a crown woven with thorns. Her early years were spent in the soft vineyards and golden halls of France. She was sent away to escape the political maelstrom that brewed in Scotland, and there, under the blue sky of the French court, she grew into a queen of rare grace and intellect. She married the Dauphin Francis and became queen consort of France. For a brief, shimmering moment, Mary seemed poised to become one of Europe's most powerful women, but that radiance was fleeting. Francis died young, and Mary returned to a Scotland changed beyond recognition, fractured by Protestant reform and suspicious of a queen shaped by Catholic France. Still, she ruled. She married again, disastrously, to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a man of noble blood but reckless temperament. Their union soured almost immediately, marred by his jealousy, drunkenness, and violent outbursts. The final rupture came when Darnley orchestrated the murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, dragging him from the Queen's chambers and stabbing him over 50 times. She was with child then, and the child within her would one day become James VI of Scotland, and later James I of England. But at the time, all Mary knew was betrayal and the chill of dread. Darnley would not live long. A strange explosion destroyed the house where he stayed, but his body was found not burned or broken, but strangled in the garden nearby. The implication was unmistakable. Someone had murdered him, and done so with precision. Suspicion turned, inevitably, to Mary. It did not help that she soon married the man many suspected had arranged Darnley's death, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Whether she did so out of love, coercion, or sheer desperation remains lost to history. But Scotland could not abide it. Her nobles rose against her, the people turned away, and Mary fled, pregnant with sorrow and hunted by those who once knelt before her. She sought refuge in England, placing her fate in the hands of her cousin, Elizabeth I. But what she received was not sanctuary. It was a prison. For 19 years, Mary lived in various castles and manors, a guest in name only. She embroidered, read scripture, wrote letters in invisible ink. The great passion of her youth hardened into endurance. She was watched, her words examined, her allies hunted. Elizabeth, whose throne Mary had once claimed as her own, now held all the keys. And then came Babington. A young Catholic nobleman, John Babington, had conspired to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary upon the English throne. Mary's name appeared in coded correspondence, deciphered and used as the noose around her neck. Whether she actively approved the plot is still debated by scholars. But in the cold reason of power, Elizabeth saw what she needed, a rival no longer in exile, but in chains. Mary was brought to trial. The proceedings were swift, cloaked in formality but lacking mercy. She stood before the court in a black gown, her composure radiant even in ruin. She defended herself not as a conspirator, but as a queen who had lost everything, her crown, her child, her home, and yet still bore herself with noble sorrow. On February 8, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary was led to the scaffold. She dressed in scarlet, the color of Catholic martyrdom, and stepped forward with grace. A crucifix in one hand, a prayer whispered upon her lips, she forgave her executioner. The first blow missed the mark. The second found her neck, but still, her spirit lingered. The third stroke was needed to free her soul from the world. When her head fell, her auburn wig came away too, revealing gray hair beneath, aged beyond her years. A small dog was found hidden in her skirts, whimpering beside her lifeless form. Elizabeth wept upon hearing the news, or so some say, perhaps with guilt, perhaps with relief. For in Mary's death, Elizabeth had slain not only a rival, but a reflection, a queen born into peril, shaped by politics and condemned by circumstance. Mary's body was buried at Peterborough, but later moved to Westminster Abbey by her son, James I, who claimed the English throne after Elizabeth's death. There, she lies today, in regal repose, not far from the very woman who signed her death warrant. Two queens, one tomb apart, and between them, a silence more thunderous than war. Thus we leave Mary, not in the moment of death, but in the quiet after. The hush of winter over stone walls, the stillness of needlework abandoned, the scent of faded lavender in a forgotten cell. Her life was not a triumph, but a lament. And yet in that lament, something enduring, something deeply, achingly human, remains. Beyond the snow-dusted hills of Wales, beneath skies that turned silver with dawn, once rose a boy with the blood of kings and the burden of destiny. His was a tale that flickered brightly before being snuffed by shadow, a flame that promised warmth and hope, only to be swallowed by the cold winds of betrayal. This is the sorrowful end of Arthur, Prince of Wales. Born in the pale spring of 1486, Arthur was the first son of Henry VI and Elizabeth of York, the union that stitched together the torn fabric of England after the Wars of the Roses. His birth was not merely celebrated, it was sanctified, a divine sign that peace might finally find a home in England's weary soil. He was named for the legendary King of Camelot, and from infancy, the realms bore promises of greatness in his ears. He was reared in magnificence and molded for monarchy. At Ludlow Castle, perched above the River Thames, he studied law and Latin, scripture and statecraft, under the vigilant guidance of tutors chosen not only for wisdom, but for loyalty. The council hoped to make of Arthur a king both noble and learned, a prince born not just to inherit, but to inspire. And he did inspire. From an early age, his demeanor was one of measured thought and grace. Gentle in speech, firm in courtesy, he walked the marbled halls of court with the weight of legacy already upon his slim shoulders. Courtiers adored him. Bishops praised his piety, and the common folk, worn by the long scars of civil war, looked to him as a symbol of a gentler age to come. But no prince can live untouched by politics. At the age of 15, Arthur was wed to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Their marriage was not only a union of hearts, but of nations, forged to strengthen ties between England and Spain, two rising powers with ambitions as vast as their coffers. The ceremony was held with grandeur at St. Paul's Cathedral, draped in gold and garlanded with celebration. The young couple was paraded through London, bathed in cheers and perfumed petals. And then together they were sent to Ludlow to begin their joint governance of the Welsh marches. Theirs was a delicate companionship. He, thin and solemn, she, dignified and reserved. Whether they ever shared more than a courtly affection, no one can say with certainty. Their words, carefully recorded and translated, speak of mutual respect, if not passion. What is known is this: they were together at Ludlow when the sickness came. It began in the wind, a sudden chill that cut through the stone walls like a whisper. The court physicians called it the sweating sickness, a dreaded affliction that struck without warning, robbing its victims of breath and color in a single day. Arthur fell ill first. Fever clutched him by the throat, and within hours, the prince who was to be king lay still beneath a canopy of mourning. He was just 15 years old. The news reached the court like a storm cloud. Henry VI was devastated, retreating into silence. Elizabeth of York was said to have collapsed upon hearing the name of her son, sobbing that our fairest hope is gone. England, still tender from its wounds, now reeled once more. Arthur's body was borne in solemn procession to Worcester Cathedral, where he was entombed beneath a slab of black marble. The inscription read simply of his virtues and his promise, but it could not capture the weight of the nation's grief. For in losing Arthur, England had not merely lost a prince. It had lost a vision of peace, a future that would never be. But from this death would spring consequences that reshaped history. Catherine of Aragon, now a widow in a foreign land, remained in England under careful watch. Years later, she would marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry, Duke of York, who would become Henry VIII. And it was this marriage, born from the ashes of Arthur's death, that would one day unravel the very fabric of English religion and royal succession. Henry would later claim that his union with Catherine was cursed, that by marrying his brother's wife, he had defied divine law. It was this very argument he used to seek an annulment, leading to England's break from Rome and the birth of the Anglican Church. All of it rooted in a single winter's death in Ludlow Castle. Arthur, who had spoken softly and dreamed gently, had never imagined such echoes. In his death, he became the axis upon which centuries turned. He left no child, no policy, no battles or proclamations. Only memory. Only potential unfulfilled. Today, if you visit Worcester Cathedral, you may find his tomb, quiet, modest, and draped in the cool light of stained glass. Few stop to linger. Fewer still speak his name. But if you do pause and lean close, you might imagine the voice of a boy king whispering through the stone, not in command, but in question. What might have been had he lived? And so we leave Arthur, Prince of Wales, not in the fevered haze of his final hours, but in the early morning mist over Ludlow, where a boy once looked eastward and imagined the throne. A prince remembered not for his rule, but for the space his absence carved into history. Beneath the rolling hills of Burgundy and the tangled borders of the Holy Roman Empire, there once rode a duke known as the Bold, a man whose very name stirred both fear and fascination across Europe's war-torn landscape. He was Charles, Duke of Burgundy, a sovereign in all but name, whose ambition surged greater than the realm he ruled, and whose death was as savage and stark as the frozen earth that swallowed him. Charles the Bold was born in 1433 into a court of splendor and culture unmatched by any other of its day. Burgundy, though technically a vassal of the French crown, had grown into a duchy of extraordinary wealth and independence. Its cities gleamed with art and trade, its cathedrals rivaled those of Rome. And at its heart, Charles, tall, sharp-featured, and ceaselessly driven, rose with a hunger not just to defend his inheritance, but to forge a kingdom all his own. He was a knight of the old world, dreaming of chivalry even as gunpowder and cannon reshaped warfare. His armor was polished to a mirror sheen, his standards embroidered with fire-breathing dragons and golden lions. But Charles was more than a noble figure. He was a man possessed by his vision. He sought to unite Burgundy with the lands of Lorraine and Alsace, to carve a corridor between the North Sea and the Alps, to make himself a king, not in courtesy, but by conquest. Diplomacy to him was but a dance of delay. And so he went to war. His enemies were many. The Swiss Confederates, fierce and fast-moving, defied his heavy cavalry. The King of France, wary of Charles' growing might, watched with simmering envy. The Holy Roman Emperor, though kin by marriage, played his own game. But Charles charged onward, emboldened by early victories and flattered by the illusion of destiny. Then came Nancy. In the brutal winter of 1477, Charles laid siege to the city of Nancy, determined to wrest it from René II, Duke of Lorraine. Snow fell like ash upon the battlefield. Supplies dwindled. His troops, worn thin by cold and hunger, grew restless. Still, Charles refused to retreat. He had tasted glory before and believed, even now, that fortune would turn in his favor. On the morning of January 5th, the Swiss reinforcements arrived. With speed and precision, they fell upon Charles's camp. The battle was chaos. Horses floundering in deep snow, cannon fire echoing like thunder against the white hills. Charles, ever the knight, fought at the front, refusing to flee, clad in gilded armor that glinted even beneath the gray sky. When the battle ended, the Duke had vanished. For 3 days, they searched. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he had escaped, others that he had been taken prisoner. Then, near the frozen banks of a pond, they found him. His body lay naked, looted of its finery. Half devoured by wolves, it was scarcely recognizable. A massive gash split his skull. His jaw was shattered. A lance had pierced his thigh. And yet the mark that truly confirmed his identity was not a wound, but a deformity. A long, twisted fingernail, remembered by those closest to him. Thus perished Charles the Bold, once a duke of unmatched grandeur, reduced to a corpse stripped by cold and scavengers. News of his death swept through Europe like wildfire. In France, bells rang in celebration. In Burgundy, the court dissolved into panic. His only child, Mary of Burgundy, inherited a shattered duchy and with it the impossible burden of preserving her father's legacy. She would marry Maximilian of Austria, and through that union, the seeds of the Habsburg Empire would be sown. But Charles's dream of a Burgundian kingdom perished with him, buried beneath snow and silence. Today, his memory lingers in paintings, his stern face gazing from oil-darkened canvas, and in the cold stone of Dijon, where his tomb rests, a monument to both ambition and ruin. But perhaps more than anything, Charles the Bold is remembered in the lesson he left behind. That pride, when untempered, becomes a blade that turns upon its wielder. He died not as a king, but as a warning. And so we leave Charles, not in the frozen mud of that last battlefield, but in his grand halls, pacing before maps stitched with his dreams, eyes burning with the fires of legacy. The snow had not yet begun to fall. The drums of war had not yet faded. He was still the bold, still the knight, still the dreamer. For a moment he stood tall, untouched by fate. And then, as with so many before him, the cold came and took him all the same. Far from the green cathedrals of German forests and the marble halls of imperial courts, beneath the wide and foreign sky of the East, the life of one of medieval Europe's greatest monarchs came to an end. Not in battle, not by blade, but in the cold embrace of a nameless river. This is the quiet, almost unfathomable death of Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, whose name once shook the continent and whose final breath vanished into the currents of the Salef. Frederick I, called Barbarossa, meaning red beard, was born in 1122 into the great Hohenstaufen dynasty. He rose swiftly, his reign shaped by a vision of empire that echoed the grandeur of Rome. He was a man who wielded law and sword with equal measure, who could stand before popes as an equal and lead knights into battle like a warrior of old. He was no mere king, but an emperor, the earthly protector of Christendom, anointed with sacred oil and draped in the legacy of Caesar and Charlemagne. His rule stretched across Germany and northern Italy, where his campaigns sought to assert imperial will over the defiant communes of Lombardy. He built roads, raised fortresses, and drafted decrees with a meticulous hand. Under his leadership, the empire did not just endure, it shone, a glittering counterweight to the ambitions of the French crown and the spiritual supremacy of Rome. Yet for all his triumphs at home, it would be the call of a distant war that drew him into the pages of legend and tragedy. In 1187, the Christian world recoiled in horror as news reached Europe that Jerusalem had fallen to the great Muslim commander Saladin. The Pope, crying vengeance and redemption, called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade. It was a cry that echoed through the palaces and castles of Christendom, and among those who answered was the aging but undiminished Frederick Barbarossa. He was in his mid-60s then, an age when most men had long since turned their thoughts to confession and rest. But Frederick had no desire for twilight. He saw in this crusade a final proving ground, not only of his piety, but of his legacy. If he could take Jerusalem, the crown of Christian kingship would be his in both spirit and memory. So in 1189, he set out at the head of an immense host. Tens of thousands of soldiers, nobles, priests, and camp followers trailed behind him, a river of humanity winding its way across Europe. Through Hungary and the Byzantine territories they marched, facing not only the heat and dust of foreign lands, but ambushes, political treachery, and the growing fatigue of endless travel. And still, they pressed forward. By the summer of 1190, the imperial army had reached the rugged highlands of Cilicia, in the Armenian marches of Asia Minor. The sun was a hammer in the sky, and the land, though beautiful, offered little mercy. Near the banks of the river Salef, now called the Guksu, they made camp. It was June. The emperor, weary and coated in the heat of the day, sought relief in the river. Whether to bathe, to cool himself, or to cross, we do not know. What followed is cloaked in contradiction. Some say he tried to swim across in armor, underestimating the current. Others claim his horse stumbled midstream, throwing him into the depths. Another account suggests the cold water shocked his heart, stopping it instantly. But all stories agree on one grim truth. Frederick vanished beneath the water. When his men pulled him out, he was lifeless. The emperor, who had faced excommunication, civil war, and rebellion, had drowned in a narrow river, hundreds of leagues from the city he had longed to liberate. His army stood stunned. How could this giant of a man, this unshakable pillar of the empire, be taken not by sword but by stream? The reaction was swift and ruinous. Disheartened, the Crusader army fragmented. Some troops returned home. Others died in the scorched wastes of the Levant. Their hopes and banners faded. The dream of an imperial crusade dissolved in the Anatolian dust. Frederick's son attempted to preserve his father's body for burial in the Holy Land, but the methods were crude. His flesh was boiled to save the bones. The remains were buried in scattered pieces, one part in Tarsus, another in Antioch, the last perhaps never reaching consecrated ground. And yet, even in death, the myth of Frederick Barbarossa refused to fade. In German lore, he became a sleeping emperor, hidden deep within a mountain, his red beard grown through the stone table at which he rests. It is said that when Germany once again faces her greatest peril, he will rise, shaking off the centuries like dust, to lead his people once more. But history, ever quieter than myth, offers a gentler image. A solitary river, glittering under the Anatolian sun, a splash, a silence, a crown slipping beneath the surface, its weight borne down by time, ambition, and the sheer stillness of the water. There, the last breath of an emperor was taken by the land he had never meant to rule, and the sky bore no witness save the flight of birds overhead. So we leave Frederick not as a sleeping king, nor as a marble statue cast in grandeur, but as a man, sudden, mortal, and alone. A life vast as empire, ended in a single hushed moment. In the heart of medieval Castile, where the chapels echoed with solemn Latin chants, and the towers of stone castles cast long shadows across the plains, a tragedy once unfurled so quietly that its resonance was nearly swallowed by the passage of centuries. This is the forgotten story of Sancho Alfonso, a young prince whose death at the tender cusp of manhood reshaped the future of a kingdom, leaving behind only silence where a crown should have rested. Sancho was the only legitimate son of King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, a monarch known throughout the Christian and Muslim worlds alike for his military ambition and his political cunning. Alfonso had forged a dominion unlike any other in Iberia, one that reached from the storm-lashed mountains of Galicia to the sunlit plains near Toledo. His realm was stitched together by conquest, by shrewd marriages, and by a careful balancing of competing noble families. But for all his victories, Alfonso's greatest concern, as with all kings, was succession. Sancho was born in 1093 during a time of relative stability in the Christian north of the Iberian Peninsula. His mother, Isabel, is shrouded in historical ambiguity. Some say she was a noblewoman of the kingdom. Others claim she may have been of Moorish descent, perhaps even a Muslim concubine. Regardless of her origin, Sancho was recognized as legitimate and invested early with honors and responsibility. His presence was a living promise to the nobility that Alfonso's bloodline, and thus the unity of the kingdom, would continue. The prince was raised in a court that blended Christian austerity with the sophistication of the Andalusian frontier. He learned Latin and Arabic, swordplay, and statesmanship. The monks praised his reverence, the knights his budding valor. His father watched him closely, molding the boy into a future sovereign who could withstand the pressures of throne and battlefield alike. By 1103, Sancho had been formally recognized as heir to the throne. He was appointed infante and granted military commands, small at first, then increasingly significant. He presided over councils, issued charters, and even governed the key city of Toledo, a shining prize of the Reconquista and a symbol of Christian restoration. But power in Castile was never secure, and shadows gathered quickly. To the south, the Almoravid dynasty, a devout and disciplined Muslim power from North Africa, had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. Unlike the fractured Taifa kingdoms that had once ruled Muslim Spain, the Almoravids were united, zealous, and militarily formidable. Their victory at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086 had already shaken Christian confidence. Now they advanced once more, retaking towns and pressing toward the heart of Alfonso's territory. In 1108, news came that Almoravid forces were massing near the castle of Ucles, a strategic outpost in the southeast. King Alfonso, aging and infirm, could not ride to war himself. Instead, he turned to Sancho, only 15 years old, yet already a commander, to lead the Castilian army into the field. It was to be his first real test. It would also be his last. The Christian army, composed of seasoned knights, noble levies, and local militias, marched south under the young prince's banner. They were confident. The memory of past victories still clung to them like perfume. But the terrain was harsh, and the Almoravid army, hardened by desert warfare and led by skilled generals, waited with discipline and guile. The two armies clashed in the early summer heat. At the Battle of Ucles, disaster struck swiftly. The Castilian knights charged forward, as was their custom, seeking to break the enemy line in a single heroic sweep. But the Almoravids had learned well from past encounters. They feigned retreat, drew the cavalry away from the infantry, and then encircled them with swift horsemen. Within hours, the field was lost. Hundreds of Castilian nobles perished. The army was shattered. Sancho, fighting alongside his retinue, was captured in the chaos. What followed is uncertain. Some say he was taken alive, offered the chance to convert or ransom. Others claim he was executed on the spot by soldiers who did not recognize or did not care who he was. What is certain is that his head was cut from his body and displayed upon a pike. A king's son, slain in foreign dust, his death announced not with bells or lamentation, but with a crude trophy above the gates of victory. When the news reached Alfonso VI, it is said he was struck silent. His heart broke not only for the loss of his son, but for the unraveling of all he had built. Sancho was the last thread of continuity. His daughters, though noble and strong-willed, could not inherit with the same certainty. The fragile unity of Leon and Castile began to fray. Civil wars and succession disputes would follow, shaking the kingdom to its foundations. Sancho was buried, quietly and without grandeur, his memory preserved only in the dry lines of the Chronicon Mundi and in fading monastic prayers. No statue bears his likeness. No tomb declares his nobility to the ages. He left behind no heirs, no writings, no final command, only the echo of a future unfulfilled. And yet, in that echo lies the weight of history. Had he lived, had he returned from Ucles in triumph, the kingdom might have passed peacefully into his hands. Perhaps the wars that followed, between Urraca and Alfonso of Aragon, between church and crown, between brother and sister, might never have come to pass. But history does not deal in might-have-beens. It deals in stones and silence. Today, the field of Ucles lies quiet beneath the Castilian sun. Wildflowers bloom where blood once soaked the earth. Shepherds pass with their flocks, unaware that a prince died here before he could become a king. So we leave Sancho Alfonso, not in the dust of defeat, but in the bright promise of youth, his armor unscathed, his banner catching the wind, and his eyes fixed on the horizon. He believed, as all young heirs do, that his destiny was certain. But the world does not always honor certainty, and on that field, beneath a sky indifferent to crowns, the last true heir of Alfonso VI vanished into legend. In the damp, windswept wilds of Ireland, where mist coils around ancient stone and the air carries the scent of peat and sea, the story of a tragic young prince quietly rests beneath centuries of sorrow. It is a tale largely forgotten, spoken only in the soft hush of monastic halls or in the twilight verses of bardic lament. This is the death of Edward, Earl of Warwick, the last legitimate male Plantagenet of his line, whose life was woven from shadow and suspicion, and whose end came not in rebellion or war, but behind the cold walls of the Tower of London. Edward was born in 1475 into a world of silk and steel. He was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, brother to King Edward IV, and thus a prince of the royal blood, and Isabel Neville, daughter of the powerful Earl of Warwick, the so-called Kingmaker. His lineage was royal on every branch, and his future should have been bright. But in England, where power shifted as swiftly as the tide, blood was often more a burden than a blessing. Tragedy struck early. Edward's father, George, had once dreamed of the throne himself. His ambition, fierce and poorly veiled, made him dangerous. Suspected of plotting treason against his own brother, George was imprisoned in the Tower and in 1478 executed by order of King Edward IV. Rumors whispered that he met his end by drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine. A tale both grim and theatrical, befitting the turbulence of the age. Edward, only a toddler at the time, was orphaned and placed under royal custody. He was given the title Earl of Warwick, but the name would come to mean more prison than privilege. The Wars of the Roses, that long and bloody feud between the houses of Lancaster and York, were coming to their final act. Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth in 1485 ended the reign of Richard III and established a new dynasty, the Tudors. Henry VII, keen to solidify his tenuous claim to the throne, married Elizabeth of York and sought to erase all rival claims. But young Edward, though just 10 years old, was a problem that could not be ignored. He was the last surviving male heir of the House of York, and in him, some saw a rightful king. To neutralize this threat, Henry had Edward taken to the Tower of London. Officially, he was under protection. In truth, he was a prisoner. The years passed in quiet confinement. While England changed outside, new alliances, new taxes, new roads and ships, Edward remained in the same gray stone rooms. He was not tortured. He was not interrogated. He was simply forgotten. A child when he entered the tower, a young man when the outside world remembered him again. Then came the pretender. In 1499, a man named Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the lost princes in the tower, led a failed rebellion against Henry VII. Though captured and imprisoned, Warbeck still stirred unrest among Yorkist loyalists. Fearful of any renewed uprising, Henry turned his attention to Edward once more. It was said that Warbeck and Edward had spoken in secret, conspiring to escape. Whether this was true or manufactured as justification, it hardly mattered. The result was inevitable. Edward, aged 24 and having spent most of his life in isolation, was tried for treason. The proceedings were swift and carefully managed. His guilt was assumed, not debated. His sentence? Death. On a cold November morning in 1499, Edward was led to Tower Hill. He had never commanded an army. He had never uttered a public speech. He had never worn a crown, nor signed a decree. He had lived as a prince and died as a prisoner. It is said he walked calmly to the scaffold, confused but composed, more like a boy going to church than a man going to his death. He was beheaded with a single stroke. The people, even those loyal to Henry, murmured uneasily. Edward had done nothing. He had ruled nothing. He had conspired in silence, if at all. But he had the blood of kings, and in the fragile world of Tudor legitimacy, that alone was enough to seal his fate. Henry's motives were as political as they were personal. A marriage had been proposed between his son, the future Henry VIII, and Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain. But the Spanish court was uneasy with a living Yorkist claimant lingering in the tower. With Edward gone, the alliance was secured, and so a life was traded for a treaty. Today, there is no grand tomb for Edward. His remains rest somewhere near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower precincts, alongside queens and traitors alike. His name appears briefly in the scrolls of dynastic succession, a note of what might have been had the world been kinder. We remember him not for his deeds, but for his silence, for the long, unspoken years behind stone walls, for the way history sometimes forgets the gentle and fears the innocent. So we leave Edward now, standing in his final hour, beneath the gray London sky, the wind tugging at his simple cloak, his eyes perhaps searching the crowd for one familiar face. There is none, only the axe. And then, the hush. The year was 1286, and the wind howled over the wild, frost-laced hills of Scotland. In Edinburgh, the firelight in the halls of Craigmillar Castle flickered with nervous expectancy. King Alexander III, monarch of Scots, stood at the height of his power. His kingdom for once was whole, free from war, prosperous, and breathing the quiet sigh of a land not yet torn by succession strife. But as is so often the pattern in these tales, peace in the realm does not ensure peace in the heart, or safety for the one who wears the crown. Alexander was by then a man of nearly 45 years, broad in the shoulder, fierce in his youth but tempered now by grief. His beloved wife, Queen Margaret of England, had died years earlier, and with her had gone the spark that once danced in his eyes. He had 3 children, each a star to guide the lineage of the Bruce and the Balliol, but fate, as if in quiet rebellion against his peace, had taken all 3. One by one, his heirs passed, his sons, David and Alexander, to illness, his daughter Margaret to childbirth. The last glimmer of succession now lay in the hands of his granddaughter, the Maiden of Norway, barely a child, distant and fragile. Still, Alexander held hope. On a stormy March evening, the king had departed from Edinburgh, seeking to reach Kinghorn Castle across the Firth of Forth. He had just left a council meeting, spirits lifted by the company of close companions. The wine had flowed, and laughter echoed through the chamber. Some say the king, though aging, was filled with renewed vigor. He had remarried the year before to Yolande of Dreux, a young noblewoman of French birth, and there was already whisper of a possible heir. But the skies grew treacherous that night. Darkness swallowed the land, and the roads turned slick with rain. Despite the pleading of his retinue, Alexander insisted on riding through the storm. There were reports that his queen awaited him. Others suggest it was restlessness that spurred him on, a fear of idle thoughts left unchecked in the quiet hours. Whatever the cause, the king refused delay. His companions lost him briefly in the tempest. The torches sputtered in the wind, and the treacherous path ahead grew near invisible. Somewhere between Burntisland and Kinghorn, amid the wind-lashed cliffs, Alexander's horse stumbled. The details remain a matter of speculation. Some claim he slipped and fell from a ledge, dashed upon the rocks below. Others whispered darker theories, that foul play hastened his fall, or that a spirit of the highlands, displeased with his defiance, had pulled him into the abyss. Come morning, a search party discovered the lifeless body of the king, broken at the foot of a steep embankment. The storm had passed by then, and a gentle mist hung in the air, as if nature herself mourned the passing of a sovereign. His face, though pale, still bore a regal expression, and his hands were folded across his breast, as if in final prayer. Scotland reeled at the news. A great hush fell upon the court, and the widowed Queen Yolande, just weeks into her marriage, was inconsolable. She claimed to dream of Alexander's ghost in the nights that followed, his figure outlined in silver moonlight, forever riding toward a distant shore. Yet the king's death was only the beginning of sorrow. With no living heirs of full age, the kingdom fell into a terrible uncertainty. The lords and nobles, once united under Alexander's steady hand, turned upon each other in desperation. The throne sat empty, and from the silence, a contest began to stir, a struggle for succession that would in time bring the wars of Scottish independence. Historians later referred to it as the death that shattered peace, and it was. For a single misstep, perhaps of hooves on wet stone, had changed the course of a kingdom. The Bruce family, ambitious and cunning, began their campaign. The Balliols laid their claims through parchment and persuasion. And in the midst of it all, the tiny maiden of Norway, barely more than a toddler, was summoned across the North Sea, her frail life the fragile thread holding back the tide of civil war. But young Margaret would not survive the journey. Her tale, too, we shall come to. Yet as the bells of St. Giles tolled for Alexander, and candles burned for weeks in his memory, the people of Scotland walked in sorrowful quiet. Farmers laid garlands in the fields, fishermen cast their nets with solemn prayers, and old women by the hearth whispered of a king who rode into storm and never returned, not just a monarch, but the last true light before the gathering dark. In the years to come, songs would be sung of that night. Some romanticized it, a noble end for a noble man, carried into the afterlife by the northern winds. Others spoke in fearful tones, warning of what happens when pride defies prudence. But all agreed upon this. Alexander III's fall marked more than the loss of a life. It was the falling of a kingdom's balance, and the end of an age that had known peace, however brief. And so ends the 9th hour of our unfolding tale. Let the echoes of hoofbeats fade into the mist. Let the rain wash the stones once more. And as night falls over the highlands, let us close our eyes, imagining the last ride of a king, through shadow, silence, and storm. Far across the gray and churning sea, where Norway's fjords rise like ancient fingers of stone from the cold Atlantic waters, a tiny cradle rocked in the shadows of a royal chamber. Here, the story left behind by Alexander III found its next and most delicate chapter. The child who bore the future of a kingdom, Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway, was scarcely more than a breath, a flicker of fragile life, barely 5 years of age. And yet, upon her frail shoulders, rested the crown of Scotland. Margaret was the daughter of King Eric II of Norway and Margaret of Scotland, the late daughter of Alexander III. Her mother had died giving birth to her, and so the little girl grew beneath the watchful eyes of her Norse kin, unaware of the tremors her very existence sent through the stone chambers of Stirling and Scone. After the sudden and sorrowful fall of Alexander, there were no direct heirs of full age to take the throne. The Scottish nobility, desperate to preserve the realm from descent into chaos, turned their gaze eastward, across the wind-torn waters, and called for the child to be brought home. It was not a decision free of concern. The idea of a foreign-bred child queen was met with unease, and behind closed doors, alliances began to form, whispering their preferences for other claimants. Yet for many, especially the guardians of the realm, there was no clearer hope than Margaret. Her blood was pure, her lineage sacred, and in her quiet, solemn eyes, many saw the last flickering thread that might hold Scotland together. In the autumn of 1290, a voyage was prepared. Ships were readied in Bergen, white sails stitched with royal sigils and lined with fine timber and linen for the comfort of the tiny queen. The journey would not be easy. The North Sea, even in its gentler moods, is an unforgiving passage. But those who planned the voyage knew the stakes. Scotland waited with bated breath. Even the English crown, then ruled by Edward Thurse, watched closely, for he saw in the child's return an opportunity to entwine Scotland's destiny with his own. Edward had already begun to position himself as a sort of paternal figure to the realm. He proposed that Margaret be betrothed to his son, the young Edward of Caernarfon, later Edward II, a union that, in theory, might unite the crowns peacefully. The Treaty of Bergen, drawn up that very year, stipulated that while the marriage might proceed, Scotland would remain independent. But treaties, like oaths, often fracture in the face of ambition. Margaret, unaware of such schemes, was placed aboard the ship with her small court and trusted caretakers. The winds howled early that season, and though the ship was sturdy, its passengers were not prepared for the bitter, relentless voyage. The sea churned with growing violence. Some accounts say that Margaret grew sick not long after departure. Others suggest she was already ailing before she set sail, weakened by the stress and upheaval of leaving her familiar home for a foreign land filled with strangers. What is certain is this: the ship never reached its intended port. Somewhere off the coast of Orkney, the child took ill. Fever racked her small body, and her cries, once soft and sweet, turned faint and labored. The crew, helpless against the storm and the sickness alike, did what they could, but medicine in those times was little more than prayer and desperation. On the deck of the vessel, surrounded by weeping maids and murmured Norse psalms, the little queen breathed her last. She was not yet 7. The news of her death, when it reached the Scottish court, caused a silence more profound than any the kingdom had known. It was not merely the end of a life, it was the end of a dream, a future tied together with diplomacy and hope, now torn by the fickle cruelty of fate. There was no procession, no royal funeral upon her homeland soil. Her body, some say, was returned to Norway and buried in the gray cathedral of Bergen. Others claim it never left the sea. With Margaret's passing, the line of Alexander III was extinguished, and Scotland was cast into a void of uncertainty. 13 claimants came forward, each with parchment and pedigree in hand, each demanding the crown. And looming over them all stood Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, who now saw in the chaos an opening for conquest. The guardians of Scotland, burdened by the impossible task of choosing a new sovereign, turned to Edward for arbitration. It was a choice made not from trust, but necessity. And Edward, a master of pretense, agreed, on the condition that he be acknowledged as overlord of Scotland. Thus began the slow tightening of chains around the neck of a proud nation. But all that still lay ahead. For now, we drift with the waves, beside the ghost of a child queen lost at sea. Her memory remains gentle, untouched by war or treachery, a symbol of innocence caught between dynasties. In her death, she became legend, not for what she did, but for what she might have been. So rest now, dear listener, and let the wind carry you to that quiet place where stars blink upon the ocean's edge, and where a tiny crown, too heavy for one so small, lies untouched upon a foreign shore. With the death of young Margaret, Maid of Norway, Scotland stood hollow and trembling beneath the shadow of its own uncertain future. The crown, once clear in its lineage, now lay adrift like a leaf upon a storm-bound river. The lords of the realm, noble houses bound more by pride than unity, turned wary eyes upon one another. And across the border, Edward I of England watched with cold calculation the threads of his influence already snaking deep into the heart of Scottish affairs. It was in this fragile hour, with the kingdom shivering upon the edge of anarchy, that a peculiar and sorrow-laden chapter began to unfold. A chapter not of battles or coronations, but of a soul devoured slowly, not by blade or betrayal, but by grief so heavy it bent the very spine of a monarch. This is the tale of Queen Eleanor of Castile, beloved wife of Edward I, whose end came not upon a field of war or in the clash of court intrigue, but in the quiet, aching descent of love's own undoing. Eleanor was not Scottish, nor even native to the lands she came to rule beside her husband. Born in Castile, in the sun-drenched courts of medieval Spain, she was a princess bred among poets, relics, and pilgrimage routes. She was wedded to Edward when both were still young, barely more than children themselves. At first, their union was one of politics, a contract signed by distant kings. But as seasons passed, it grew into something rare among royalty, a marriage built upon mutual affection, loyalty, and unwavering tenderness. They journeyed together through war and crusade. She followed Edward to the Holy Land, braving plague and desert, bearing child after child, even as disease claimed many. 17 children would be born of their union. Only a handful would live past infancy. Yet through all of it, Eleanor remained at his side, fierce, learned, and endlessly devoted. And Edward, though known to history as a hard and ruthless king, was never harder than when she was near. With Eleanor, he was softened. Her letters, discovered centuries later, reveal a queen fluent in Latin, French, and Castilian, thoughtful, intelligent, and a deft steward of estates. She was no idle consort, but rather a ruler in her own right, tending to the royal household, negotiating land disputes, and serving as the unshakable center of Edward's storm-strewn reign. But in the year 1290, the same bitter season that stole young Margaret away, Eleanor too fell ill. They had been traveling, as they often did, from one royal holding to another, when Eleanor began to show signs of a wasting sickness. Whether it was fever, consumption, or a slow corruption of the lungs, no record can say for certain. But what is known is that Edward, upon hearing her breath had grown shallow, abandoned all royal business and hastened to her side. They made slow progress through the Midlands of England, pausing in smaller manors to rest. Edward refused to leave her, tending to her with a devotion that stunned his courtiers. The king, who once shattered Welsh resistance and crushed rebellious barons, was seen now lifting a damp cloth to his queen's brow, or whispering Castilian lullabies to calm her in the night. Eleanor bore the pain with the same quiet grace that had marked her life. She knew her body was failing. The last of their children, a young girl named Elizabeth, was barely weaned, and Eleanor held her often in the final weeks, as though imprinting her memory upon the child's soft skin. She made her confessions, took the sacrament, and wrote letters to each of her surviving children. Letters that, it is said, Edward kept until his own death. On the 28th of November, in the house of Richard Weston, in the small village of Harby near Lincoln, Eleanor passed away. The wind that day was still, and the land cloaked in early frost. Edward was with her, clasping her hand as she slipped into sleep for the last time. He did not speak for hours after her final breath. What followed was a mourning unlike any other. Edward ordered that her body be transported to Westminster Abbey for burial, but he did not permit it to be hurried. At every stop along the journey, 12 places in all, he commanded that a stone cross be built to mark where her coffin had rested. These would come to be known as the Eleanor crosses, and though few remain intact today, they were once among the most striking symbols of royal grief in the medieval world. Each cross was elaborately carved, adorned with statues of the Queen and inscriptions in Latin. At Waltham, St. Albans, Geddington, and other towns along the route, the people gathered to mourn. Bells rang solemnly, and prayers were spoken in cathedrals and chapels. Some chroniclers described Edward's grief as unnatural in its intensity, not unbecoming but rare, especially for a king of his age and station. When the funeral procession at last reached Westminster, Eleanor was laid to rest near the high altar, in a tomb of dark marble. Edward remained by her grave for hours, refusing counsel, refusing food. In his journals, sparse as they were, he penned a single line in the days following her interment: "My heart lies buried with her." And indeed, though he would live another 17 years and remarry for the sake of alliance, Edward was never the same. His wrath toward the Scots, his harsh policies, and the later years of iron rule were tempered not by cruelty alone, but by absence. The anchor of his life had slipped from the world, and the man who had once known gentleness was lost. Eleanor of Castile died not in battle nor betrayal, but her death echoed through the halls of power like thunder in a cloister. Hers was a royal passing made unbearable by its intimacy. And though history often remembers kings for their wars, Eleanor is remembered not for her conquests, but for the love she left behind, and the sorrow she took with her. Now, as the night deepens and the stars scatter across the velvet sky, let your breath soften with hers. Let the hush of ancient cathedrals and the morning toll of Westminster's bells carry you gently towards sleep. For even in death, there are stories that soothe. And Eleanor's, quiet and steadfast, is one such story. In the years that followed the death of Eleanor of Castile, the wheels of power turned without pause, grinding ever forward through the bloodied soil of medieval ambition. The kingdoms of England and Scotland, once held in precarious balance by treaties, marriages, and hopes, now teetered at the edge of open conflict. But before war would rise, before swords would be drawn in earnest, another tale unfolded. One quieter, cloaked not in iron and banners, but in whispered doubt and the dark corridors of courtly suspicion. This is the story of Joan of Acre, the daughter of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, whose life, though marked by privilege, was not immune to the bitter winds of courtly fate. Her death, veiled in ambiguity and quiet tragedy, would leave behind more questions than answers. Joan was born in the spring of 1272 in the Crusader stronghold of Acre, where her parents had taken refuge during the Ninth Crusade. It was a time of great uncertainty, and her early days were filled with the clamor of foreign tongues and the scent of salt and incense from the Levantine coast. As she grew, the court returned to England, and Joan blossomed into a young woman of striking wit and presence. Her first marriage was arranged when she was barely 12 to Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, a man several decades her senior. He was one of the most powerful nobles in England, wealthy, ambitious, and battle-hardened. The match was political, as were so many of the age, but Joan bore her role with poise. She gave him several children, presided over their estates with competence, and made herself a fixture of noble society. But Joan was no mere shadow of her husband. She inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's strength of will. When Gilbert died, leaving her a widow in her late 20s, she did not retreat into mourning or allow herself to be quietly packaged into another alliance. Instead, she did something nearly unthinkable. She married for love. The man she chose was Ralph de Monthermer, a squire of no great title or land, a man of humble birth who had served in her household. By the time the king, her father, learned of the marriage, it had already been secretly solemnized. Edward was furious. He had been preparing a new alliance for Joan, one that would secure his northern borders, and her defiance was not only personal, it was political. Edward had Ralph imprisoned, and Joan herself was briefly banished from court. Yet even in the face of royal wrath, she refused to annul the union. Letters between them suggest a deep affection, a bond forged not in ceremony, but in shared laughter and quiet conversations. Eventually, Edward relented, and Ralph was released, granted titles and lands befitting his new status. It seemed for a time that Joan had triumphed. Yet peace in such matters is rarely lasting. By 1307, Joan was in her mid-30s, living in relative contentment with Ralph and their children. But then came a strange and sudden change. Reports from their estate in Suffolk began to mention a lingering illness. Joan, once lively and radiant, began to withdraw from the household. She became pale, listless. Some said she suffered from a wasting sickness. Others whispered of a slow poisoning. No formal record of her ailment survives. Chroniclers mention her death only briefly, and none offer detail. She died quietly in April of that year, buried in the Priory of Clay beside her first husband, not her second. And in that decision, a deeper story may be buried. Why she was not laid to rest beside Ralph remains unknown. Was it the result of royal intervention, a final punishment for her earlier rebellion? Or was it a choice she herself made, perhaps out of a sense of duty to her children by Gilbert de Clare? Her tomb bore no grand inscription, no claim of passion or politics, just a name, a date, and silence. But in the wake of her passing, unease settled over the court. Ralph, once elevated, found himself gently but steadily pushed aside. He faded from royal favor, his titles diminished, his presence at court reduced to ceremonial appearances. His grief, too, was quiet, dignified, but profound. He never remarried. Among the servants of Joan's household, there persisted strange rumors. Some claimed her death was hastened by a potion given under the guise of medicine. Others insisted she had been suffering visions in her final days, speaking to her late mother, Eleanor, and murmuring of roads she would soon travel. One account, half forgotten in the dusty corner of a monastic ledger, claims that a single white rose was found upon her pillow the morning after she died, despite none having grown near the estate that spring. Such whispers, though impossible to verify, linger like fog over the meadows of history. And so Joan of Acre remains a mystery, neither saint nor schemer, but something far more human. A woman who dared, in a time of hard crowns and harder hearts, to love and choose freely. Her life, though cloaked in privilege, was also touched by the same quiet sorrows that haunt so many untold lives. Now let your breath grow soft and your thoughts drift to a candlelit chamber where a queen's daughter once defied a kingdom. Let the hush of her final night lull you, like the distant chiming of chapel bells through ivy-covered stone. For in that silence, her story still lingers, waiting to be remembered. In the early 14th century, the tide of fate continued its ceaseless motion, pulling even the mightiest into its depths. The Plantagenet court, a place of opulence and order, where banners of gold and crimson hung like embroidered omens, had already seen the quiet sorrow of Joan of Acre fade into memory. But now another story began to unfold, one steeped not in gentle loss, but in suspicion, cruelty, and a death so grim it echoed through the stones of Berkeley Castle for generations. This is the tale of Edward the Fifth, King of England, son of the formidable Edward I, husband to Isabella of France, and how the crown, heavy upon his brow, led not to glory, but to a bitter and ignoble end. Edward's reign began in the long shadow of his father's legacy. Edward I had been a conqueror, a lawgiver, a hammer of rebellion. His son, by contrast, was gentler, more inclined toward music, the arts, and the companionship of favorites. It was this softness, this refusal to meet the world's brutal pace with equal iron, that would be his undoing. From the earliest days of his rule, Edward II favored men whom the court despised. First, there was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of charm and extravagance, raised high by Edward's affection. The nobles, offended by Gaveston's arrogance and the king's blind loyalty, grew restless. They accused the favorite of corrupting the king's judgment, of siphoning off lands and honors meant for England's great houses. Eventually, in a cruel twist of political justice, they captured Gaveston and executed him, without trial, without royal consent. Edward never forgave them. Though he complied outwardly, his soul hardened, and into the vacuum of Gaveston's death stepped another, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been flamboyant, Despenser was venom-cloaked in silk. He rose swiftly, wielding his influence to amass land and crush rivals. Edward adored him, and once again the court watched in growing fury as England's resources were drained into the Despenser's grasp. Meanwhile, Edward's marriage to Isabella of France had soured. Once called the she-wolf of France, Isabella was cunning and ambitious, traits sharpened by years of neglect and humiliation. She had given the king an heir, the future Edward III, but found herself increasingly isolated, while the Despensers ruled her husband's court. In 1325, under the pretense of diplomacy, Isabella departed for France with her son, and from there began her quiet rebellion. She allied herself with Roger Mortimer, an exiled lord who had once defied the king. Their bond, born of shared resentment and perhaps forbidden affection, became the seed of a coup. By the autumn of 1326, they returned to England at the head of an invading force. The kingdom, long oppressed under Edward and his favorites, crumbled before them. Nobles defected, towns opened their gates, and within weeks, Edward was a fugitive. He was captured in South Wales and brought north in chains. The Despensers were executed, one hanged, drawn, and quartered before a jeering crowd. And Edward, once anointed sovereign of England, was imprisoned in the cold, damp halls of Berkeley Castle, a prisoner not of war, but of his own throne. What happened next is veiled in a darkness thick with conjecture. For months, Edward remained at Berkeley, guarded by men loyal to Mortimer and Isabella. He was allowed no visitors, no letters, no solace. Contemporary accounts suggest he was moved from cell to cell to avoid detection, denied warmth and food beyond what was necessary to keep him barely alive. Rumors filtered through the realm that he was being slowly starved, that he was tormented in body and spirit, that he cried out in Latin prayers during the long nights, begging forgiveness from a god he felt had turned his face away. And then, in September of 1327, came the death. The announcement was simple. King Edward II had died of natural causes at Berkeley Castle. But few believed it. Chroniclers wrote with caution, but whispers among the court spread like wildfire. One tale, horrific in its detail, claimed that Edward had been murdered by the insertion of a red-hot poker, driven into his body in such a way as to leave no outward mark. It was said that his screams echoed for miles, silenced only when the deed was done. No blade, no poison, only fire, and the desire to preserve the illusion of a natural death. Whether this account was truth or slander, it remains contested. What is certain is this: Edward's death was not mourned by many, but it haunted more than it comforted. Even his son, the young Edward III, later distanced himself from the act, executing Mortimer for treason and imprisoning Isabella for her part in the regicide. It was as if the new king wished to scrub clean the blood left by his parents' ambition. Edward II was laid to rest in Gloucester Cathedral, beneath a tomb of alabaster and gold. The effigy carved above him bore a gentle, almost innocent face, so unlike the troubled man who had once worn the English crown. Pilgrims came for years to kneel at his grave, some out of loyalty, others in curiosity, and some in silent horror, wondering if justice had ever truly touched the chambers of Berkeley Castle. Now, as the hour grows late and shadows deepen in the corners of your room, let us remember Edward not as history's fool, nor only as a fallen king, but as a soul undone by love, betrayal, and the merciless expectations of a crown. In the stillness of the night, listen for the sigh of the wind, as if it carries the last breath of a monarch whose end remains shrouded in flame and silence. Through the mists of power and penitence, the lineage of Plantagenet kings pressed onward, as if the tragedy of Edward II were but a fleeting storm, acknowledged and buried, yet never fully forgotten. The throne, ever thirsty, demanded its next bearer, and the realm shifted under the weight of a new monarch, Edward III, bold and brilliant, determined to restore the honor so blighted by his father's fall. But this chapter, whispered more quietly through the pages of medieval memory, does not concern him. Instead, it turns toward a royal death less known, but no less tragic, a life caught in the silent violence of exile, and a passing that bore no crown, no procession, only the cool stone of an abbey far from home. This is the tale of Blanche of Bourbon, a queen in name and little else, whose end came not in grandeur, but in abandonment. Born in 1339 to Peter I, Duke of Bourbon, and Isabella of Valois, Blanche was a princess of France, raised amidst courts gleaming with pageantry, yet steeped in the precarious intricacies of alliance. She was gentle of manner, fluent in music and scripture, and known for a pale beauty that seemed almost ethereal. From an early age, she was chosen for a destiny not her own, promised to a king across the mountains who would see her not as a bride, but as a pawn. That king was Peter of Castile, called by some Peter the Cruel, and by others Peter the Just. He ruled with a hand both swift and merciless. His court was a place of shifting loyalties, where executions followed banquets and trust was a currency spent far too easily. When the match was proposed, Peter's interest lay not in Blanche, but in the dowry she would bring, vast sums of gold from the French crown, meant to bolster his war-torn coffers. Their union was solemnized in 1353. Blanche, 17 and resplendent in the white and silver silk of her house, was brought to Valladolid. The ceremony was grand, a spectacle befitting a queen, but scarcely had the vows been spoken when the veil of ceremony was torn away to reveal the truth. Within days, Peter abandoned her. It is said he had fallen in love with another, Maria de Padilla, a Castilian noblewoman of striking charm, whose influence over the king was deep and unshakable. Peter dismissed Blanche to a distant fortress, forbidding her from court, denying her even the dignity of presence. Her pleas went unanswered. The French envoys who had accompanied her returned in shame, and Blanche remained, a queen in title only, imprisoned within the cold walls of Medina Sidonia, then later transferred to the remote and windswept fortress of Jerez. For years, she lived thus, alone, watched by guards, surrounded by silence. Letters she sent to her family begged for rescue, for reconciliation, for recognition. But war was rising across Europe, and her plight was forgotten amid the clamor of larger affairs. Peter continued to rule with iron ferocity, eliminating rivals and turning his kingdom into a field of blood. The people, once hesitant to judge him, began to murmur in fear. Maria de Padilla died in 1361, and though Peter mourned her, he never recalled Blanche to court. Some claim he declared retroactively that Maria had been his true wife all along, further deepening Blanche's humiliation. Her death came quietly. In 1361, barely 8 years after her ill-fated marriage, Blanche died in captivity. The official report gave illness as the cause, but few believed it. Whispers passed among the monastic halls of Jerez that she'd been poisoned on Peter's orders, a final, cruel act meant to erase her presence from Castile entirely. There was no royal funeral, no weeping crowd. Her body was taken to the convent of Saint-Denis in France, buried without ceremony among her Bourbon kin. The French court expressed outrage, but it was muted. Politics demanded caution, and Blanche's death became a diplomatic footnote rather than a cause for war. And yet, her memory endured. In the decades to follow, songs were written in her name, soft ballads sung by wandering minstrels lamenting the White Queen, La Reina Blanca, who died without ever truly ruling. Poets imagined her wandering castle corridors, wrapped in a shawl of moonlight, whispering the name of a husband who had forgotten her before the ink on their vows had dried. And in the folk memory of Castile, she became a ghostly figure, a pale lady glimpsed in the ruined chambers of distant towers, forever waiting for a justice that never came. Blanche of Bourbon's death was not marked by the grandeur of martyrdom nor the flames of rebellion. Hers was a subtler tragedy, the quiet erosion of self, the slow fading of a life left untended, unloved, unseen. Now, as the firelight dims and the hush of sleep nears, let us remember her not as a forgotten bride, but as a soul of gentle defiance. Let the wind through the olive grove sing her lullaby, and may her rest, long denied in life, come at last in peace. The winding roads of history rarely run smooth, and in the Kingdom of France, during the waning years of the 14th century, those roads twisted like ivy along the crumbling stones of power. It was a time when even the most gilded halls hid shadows beneath their splendor, shadows not of rebellion or treason, but of madness itself. For the story now unfolding is not one of daggers or poison, but of a slow and tragic unraveling of the mind, and of a royal death that began long before the final breath was drawn. This is the tale of King Charles VI of France, called by some Charles the Beloved, but remembered by most as Charles the Mad. Born in 1368 to King Charles V and Joanna of Bourbon, young Charles ascended to the throne at the age of 11. His father had been a careful and learned man, known for his wisdom and strength of governance. The burden that passed to Charles, however, would prove far heavier than anyone could have foreseen. In his youth, Charles was tall, handsome, and full of promise. He was crowned at Reims amid the grandeur of tradition, with the golden fleur-de-lis glinting beneath cathedral arches. At first, he ruled well, advised by a circle of experienced uncles and counselors. He married Isabeau of Bavaria, and their court blossomed with music, color, and elegance. The people rejoiced in the presence of a king who seemed both noble and just. But then, one hot summer day in 1392, the spell broke. Charles was riding through the forest of Le Mans on his way to confront a rebellious noble when something in his mind snapped. A sudden clatter of steel, perhaps a dropped lance, perhaps a simple misstep, sent him into a frenzy. Drawing his sword, he turned upon his own men, slashing wildly, shouting incoherently. 4 knights fell before he was restrained, and when the rage passed, Charles collapsed, trembling and speechless. At first, many believed it a passing madness brought on by heat or stress. But the episodes returned, irregular and terrifying. He began to suffer from delusions, believing he was made of glass, and forbidding anyone to touch him lest he shatter. He forgot the names of his children, mistook his wife for a stranger, and often failed to recognize himself in mirrors. At times, he fled into the corridors of the palace in terror, hiding from imagined assassins. He would go for hours without speech, only to break the silence with wails or sudden proclamations of death and doom. Doctors and priests were summoned, holy relics were paraded before him, and prayers chanted day and night. Yet nothing stayed the king's descent. France, already fractured by the 100 Years' War, now found itself with a monarch who drifted between lucidity and lunacy like a ship upon a fog-bound sea. The royal household began to fracture. His wife, Isabeau, struggled to maintain order, but found herself increasingly isolated. maligned by nobles who accused her of everything from adultery to witchcraft. The king's brother, Louis of Orleans, and his cousin, John the Fearless of Burgundy, began a feud for influence that would ignite the flames of civil war. The Dauphin, the king's heir, was still a child, and the court soon became a battlefield of whispers and ambition. Charles's condition grew worse. Some days he would dress in sackcloth, convinced he was a monk. Other days he insisted on elaborate courtly rituals, demanding that dancers and musicians surround him, even as he wept without reason. In a strange twist of fate, during his moments of clarity, he would issue edicts that showed deep insight and wisdom, only to descend again into incoherence by the time they were enacted. For over 30 years, France lived under a king whose mind was as unpredictable as the wind. He was not deposed, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps fear of divine wrath. Instead, regents ruled in his name, and Charles became a figure more ghost than sovereign, wandering the gardens of the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris with blank eyes and tattered robes. In 1422, after decades of suffering, Charles finally passed away. His body, worn by years of mental torment, failed quietly in the early hours of October. He died in his bed, surrounded not by courtiers or heralds, but by a handful of silent servants and a priest whispering the final rites. His son, the future Charles VII, would inherit a realm torn by war and despair. Charles VI was buried in Saint-Denis, among the kings of old, his tomb inscribed with titles he no longer understood. But no monument could capture the sorrow of a reign undone not by battle, but by the quiet, creeping affliction of the mind. His life became legend, tales of the Glass King passing from one generation to the next, a symbol of vulnerability behind the veil of majesty. And so, in this soft hour of reflection, let us pause beside the memory of Charles, neither monster nor martyr, but a man adrift within himself. As night stretches its fingers across the earth, may his troubled soul find the peace that eluded him in life. Let the wind through the palace halls grow still, and let sleep come, gentle as a whisper in a forgotten chapel. In the deepening twilight of medieval England, where the roses of Lancaster and York would soon begin their slow and bitter bloom, there stood a quiet figure at the center of a court that had forgotten how to listen. A king not cruel nor warlike, not brilliant nor bold, but gentle, perhaps too gentle for the world he was born to govern. His name was Henry VI, and his was a life unraveled not with violence, but with stillness, silence, and sorrow. He was born in 1421, the only son of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, a child of legacy and burden. His father, the warrior king, had died before the boy's first birthday, leaving the infant Henry crowned as King of England and by French claim, King of France as well. He became, in title at least, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, before he could walk, before he could speak. But the weight of crowns is not carried by infants. In his stead, regents ruled, battles raged, and alliances shifted like tides. When Henry came of age, what emerged was not a leader of iron and fire, but a deeply pious and sensitive soul, more monk than monarch, more scholar than sovereign. From his youth, Henry recoiled from violence. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, dreaming of a realm of learning and peace. He walked softly through the halls of power, often more concerned with prayer than policy, and leaned heavily on his counselors to govern. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou, a spirited and forceful French noblewoman, did little to balance the scales. Where Henry yielded, Margaret pressed, and in time her assertiveness would become the very force that held the kingdom together, until it could no longer. England, weary from war in France and increasingly restless under Henry's fragile rule, began to fracture. The nobles split into factions, and the seeds of civil war were sown. The House of York, emboldened by Henry's weakness and Margaret's influence, rose in defiance. And then, without warning, came the silence. In 1453, news of a military defeat in Gascony reached Henry, and something within him simply collapsed. He fell into what modern minds might call a catatonic state, unmoving, unresponsive, his eyes open but empty. He could neither speak nor recognize those around him. For over a year, he remained thus, seated often in the same chair, staring into space as ministers whispered behind closed doors, and his queen bore him a son he would not acknowledge. This first episode passed, but it marked the beginning of a long decline. Henry would recover briefly, only to descend again into mental darkness. His second bout of illness came during the height of the Wars of the Roses. As Yorkist armies marched and his wife fought to preserve the crown for their son, Prince Edward. Henry, meanwhile, wandered the corridors of Windsor Castle, murmuring prayers, sometimes not rising from bed for days. His reign was interrupted. In 1461, Edward of York seized the throne, declaring himself Edward IV. Henry fled, a ghost of a king, hiding in remote castles and monastic houses, sometimes in disguise, always in danger. When he was captured in 1465, he was brought back to London, not as a monarch, but as a prisoner, confined in the Tower, where stone walls echoed the quiet of his mind. There he remained for years, as Edward IV reigned and England shifted. Yet fortune is never steady, and in 1470, the crown was briefly restored to Henry by a rebellion led by the Earl of Warwick. For a few short months, Henry VI was once again king, though he ruled little, spoke less, and remained more symbol than sovereign. And then came the final fall. In 1471, Edward IV returned with renewed force, crushing the rebellion. At the Battle of Tewkesbury, Queen Margaret was captured, and their son Edward, Henry's only heir, was slain, either in battle or in cold blood after surrender. The royal line, the fragile hope of Henry's house, was extinguished in an instant. Shortly after, on the night of May 21st, Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official account claimed he died of melancholy, broken by grief upon learning of his son's death. But few believed such a convenient tale. Most accepted that he was murdered, silently, quickly, on the order of Edward IV, who could no longer risk leaving a living symbol of Lancaster behind. There was no trial, no confession. His body, when displayed, bore no clear mark of violence, though some said they saw blood upon his head. He was buried at Chertsey Abbey, later moved to Windsor by Richard III. In time, pilgrims came to his tomb, believing miracles were worked there. Some even called him a saint. Henry VI's death was not a spectacle, but it was haunting, a quiet extinguishing of a light that had never burned brightly, yet had glowed with a strange and enduring gentleness. He ruled not with strength, but with sincerity, and in a world of ambition, it proved his undoing. As you lay now in the hush of your own stillness, let his story whisper through your thoughts like the turning of chapel pages. A king of sorrow, of silence, of sleep, his life a prayer, his death a quiet requiem. Let the peace he sought, but never found, descend now upon your dreams. In the echo of Henry VI's gentle sorrow, the wheel of fate turned yet again, casting England into the grasp of bolder hands. The House of York now wore the crown, its banners flying proud beneath the sun, and with Edward IV upon the throne, it seemed the realm might breathe again. But in the tapestry of medieval kingship, peace is seldom more than a thread, and soon that thread would fray beneath the weight of whispers, ambition, and one of the most enigmatic royal deaths in English memory. This is the tale of Edward IV, the boy king who vanished before his reign could begin, and whose silent disappearance would haunt the conscience of a kingdom for centuries. He was born in 1470, during the brief resurgence of his grandfather's line, a child of exile and restoration. His father, Edward IV, had been temporarily deposed and fled to Burgundy, while his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. There, in the dim candlelight and shadowed chapels, Edward was born, a prince cradled in uncertainty. When his father reclaimed the throne, Edward V was restored with him and groomed carefully for kingship. He was bright, well-read, and carried himself with the gravity uncommon for one so young. Tutors praised his Latin, his command of scripture, and his graceful demeanor. At the age of 12, following the sudden death of Edward IV in April 1483, the crown passed to him, though he had not yet been formally crowned. It was here, in this brief and delicate moment, that fate laid its cruel snare. Edward IV had named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of the realm until the young king reached maturity. Richard, known for his loyalty and cunning, swore fealty to his nephew. But even as he knelt, the court trembled with doubt. Rivalries simmered, especially between the Woodvilles, the boy's maternal kin, and Richard's northern allies. The kingdom bristled with suspicion. Within weeks, Richard moved swiftly. He intercepted young Edward on his journey to London and placed him under protective custody in the Tower of London, ostensibly for his safety. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, joined him soon after. The Tower, though not yet the grim prison of legend, was already a place where silence could be made to last forever. And then the rumors began. Parliament was convinced to declare Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, based on a claim that he had been pre-contracted to another woman. If true, this made both princes illegitimate, and Richard the next lawful heir. On the 26th of June, 1483, Richard seized the throne as Richard III. The two boys, Edward and his brother, were seen occasionally at the Tower windows in the weeks that followed, playing or speaking softly to guards. But by late summer, their appearances ceased. No proclamation announced their death. No body was displayed. They were simply gone. In time, their names vanished from court ceremony, their existence unspoken. Richard III ruled on, his voice heavy with legitimacy, yet always shadowed by their absence. He denied any part in their disappearance, blaming it on others or refusing to speak at all. But the court whispered, and the people mourned in uncertain silence. Many believed the boys had been murdered. Theories flourished like thorns in bramble. Some said Richard had ordered their smothering in the night, fearful that their presence, however legally weakened, posed a threat to his rule. Others whispered of the Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, later his rebel, who might have acted on his own ambition. A few named Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, as the true architect, clearing the path for his own rise by extinguishing rivals before he even claimed the crown. And still, no evidence came. No trial, no grave, no confession. It wasn't until 1674, nearly 200 years later, that workers beneath a staircase in the Tower discovered a small chest. Within it were the bones of two children, interred without ceremony. Though unconfirmed, many believed them to be the lost princes, hastily buried in darkness long ago. Charles II ordered their reburial in Westminster Abbey, where they lie still, beneath a white marble slab, inscribed only with the barest of explanation. Yet even in rest, their story has never stilled. Edward V, king for barely 2 months, never crowned, never allowed to speak his truth, remains a symbol of innocence caught in the machinations of power, a boy who bore the title of majesty, only to vanish into stone and silence. Tonight, as the hush of dusk settles gently across your thoughts, let his name be spoken once more, not as a mystery nor a ghost, but as a child. A young soul lost not to war nor plague, but to the cold machinery of ambition. Let the quiet breath of the wind through the tower's ancient stones be his lullaby, and may your dreams drift gently through the pages of a history that still yearns to know what truly happened in that summer of shadows. The tale now carries us to the kingdom of Navarre, nestled between the rugged mountains and the rolling hills of the Pyrenees. In the year 1328, after the death of Charles IV of France, his daughter, Queen Joan II of Navarre, ascended to the throne. Her son, Charles, would later be crowned King of Navarre as Charles II. But this is not yet his tale. Rather, it is of Joan herself and of a mystery that surrounded her brief union with the French court, a tragedy often whispered but rarely understood. Joan had been married to Philip of Evreux, a nobleman of considerable lineage yet limited ambition. He had no designs upon the French throne, being content with his holdings in Champagne and Navarre. Yet Joan, granddaughter to Philip IV of France, carried royal blood and with it a dangerous proximity to power. For a time, the court of Navarre flourished under their joint rule. Joan was a sovereign of quiet dignity and rare intelligence. She spoke 3 languages, composed poetry, and maintained an unusual closeness with the Benedictine monasteries of Pamplona and Uwe. Her reign brought reforms to the judiciary and new opportunities for trade. Yet beneath this serene surface, something darker stirred. In 1349, while visiting her estates in the province of Champagne, Joan fell ill. It began with a fever, nothing unusual in the damp season, but quickly advanced. Reports vary, though they agree on one point: her health declined with alarming speed. Within a week, she could no longer rise from her bed. Her eyes, once alert and expressive, dulled. Her voice grew faint, as if something unseen was drawing her away from the realm of the living. At her bedside stood her husband, Philip. Contemporaries wrote of his grief, yet also noted how swiftly he acted in the days following her death. Joan passed on October 6, 1349, and by the end of that same week, Philip had issued several edicts in her name. Strange for a woman now lying in state beneath wax candles and embroidered veils. Rumors bloomed in the shadows of the cathedral. Some claimed poison, an exotic tincture from the east, too subtle for the court physicians to detect. Others whispered of a curse, for Joan had restructured a number of feudal rites, angering both nobility and clergy. Still others recalled a darker tale, that she had taken confession days before her illness, and that her confessor, a monk from Castile, vanished shortly after. Whatever the cause, Joan's death shook Navarre. The kingdom mourned, not only for the queen they had lost, but for the unspoken unease that hung like a veil across the land. Her funeral was held in the monastery of Santa Maria la Real in Pamplona. The abbey bells tolled across the hills, echoing into the valleys below, where shepherds paused and bowed their heads. Noble women dressed in black silks and lace, while men of the court bore torches and wept. But it was her son, Charles, who stood most silent of all. He was but a youth then, barely 17. His eyes, wide and dark, seemed to seek answers among the stone effigies of the family crypt. No one dared speak of the question that hung between the mourners. Why had Joan died so suddenly, so young? In the years that followed, Charles the Sec, soon to be known as Charles the Bad, would inherit not just his mother's crown, but also the tangled web of suspicions and unresolved grief she left behind. It is said that in his chambers, even after becoming king, he kept a small ivory carving of his mother holding a book. It was rumored to have been her favorite possession, yet it disappeared from the royal inventory not long after his ascension. There was, too, the matter of the monk from Castile. An inquiry was launched in the spring of 1350. Letters were sent to the nearby monasteries and messengers dispatched. Yet not a soul had seen him. His chamber, when opened, revealed nothing amiss, save for an abandoned crucifix, its chain snapped as though torn in haste. Among Joan's belongings, a single parchment was found, folded neatly within her prayer book. It contained a list of names, mostly minor nobles from Navarre and Champagne, but beside 3 names were marks in red ink. No explanation was given. The paper was dismissed by the court archivist as a list of correspondence. But when Charles reviewed it years later, he ordered the arrest of 2 of the men whose names bore the red marks. They would never be seen again. Thus ended the reign of Queen Joan II of Navarre, not with war or rebellion, but with a sickness that came and went like a storm over the mountains, leaving more questions than it answered. Her death is one of the quieter tragedies of medieval royalty. Yet within its silence lies a tension that never truly faded. For in the world of thrones and banners, where crowns are inherited and loyalty is worn like a cloak, it is not always the loudest fall that leaves the deepest wound. Sometimes it is the quiet slipping away of a ruler whose promise had only just begun to bloom, whose presence was like the gentle rustle of pages in a library long forgotten. Sleep now, as the abbey bells fade into the hills once more, and the candles flicker low beside the tomb of a queen whose truth may yet lie buried just beneath the stone. Hi, everybody. Tonight, we drift further into the shadowy annals of royal history, where the grandeur of palaces is matched only by the weight of sorrow and the silence that follows sudden loss. As we journey together through tales woven in candlelight and echoed through stone corridors, we arrive now at the 19th chapter of our story. Here, the darkness deepens around one of the lesser-known courts of Europe, where a young sovereign's ambition met a fate as swift as it was unforeseen. Lay back, let your breath fall gently, and allow this chapter to unfold like parchment in the flickering hush of twilight. The tale now carries us to the kingdom of Navarre, nestled between the rugged mountains and the rolling hills of the Pyrenees. In the year 1328, after the death of Charles IV of France, his daughter, Queen Joan II of Navarre, ascended to the throne. Her son, Charles, would later be crowned King of Navarre as Charles II, but this is not yet his tale. Rather, it is of Joan herself and of a mystery that surrounded her brief union with the French court, a tragedy often whispered but rarely understood. Joan had been married to Philip of Evreux, a nobleman of considerable lineage yet limited ambition. He had no designs upon the French throne, being content with his holdings in Champagne and Navarre. Yet Joan, granddaughter to Philip IV of France, carried royal blood and with it a dangerous proximity to power. For a time, the court of Navarre flourished under their joint rule. Joan was a sovereign of quiet dignity and rare intelligence. She spoke 3 languages, composed poetry, and maintained an unusual closeness with the Benedictine monasteries of Pamplona and Uyui. Her reign brought reforms to the judiciary and new opportunities for trade. Yet beneath this serene surface, something darker stirred. In 1349, while visiting her estates in the province of Champagne, Joan fell ill. It began with a fever, nothing unusual in the damp season, but quickly advanced. Reports vary, though they agree on one point. Her health declined with alarming speed. Within a week, she could no longer rise from her bed. Her eyes, once alert and expressive, dulled. Her voice grew faint, as if something unseen was drawing her away from the realm of the living. At her bedside stood her husband, Philip. Contemporaries wrote of his grief, yet also noted how swiftly he acted in the days following her death. Joan passed on October 6, 1349, and by the end of that same week, Philip had issued several edicts in her name. Strange for a woman now lying in state beneath wax candles and embroidered veils. Rumors bloomed in the shadows of the cathedral. Some claimed poison, an exotic tincture from the east, too subtle for the court physicians to detect. Others whispered of a curse, for Joan had restructured a number of feudal rites, angering both nobility and clergy. Still others recalled a darker tale, that she had taken confession days before her illness, and that her confessor, a monk from Castile, vanished shortly after. Whatever the cause, Joan's death shook Navarre. The kingdom mourned, not only for the queen they had lost, but for the unspoken unease that hung like a veil across the land. Her funeral was held in the monastery of Santa Maria la Real in Pamplona. The abbey bells tolled across the hills, echoing into the valleys below, where shepherds paused and bowed their heads. Noble women dressed in black silks and lace, while men of the court bore torches and wept. But it was her son Charles who stood most silent of all. He was but a youth then, barely 17. His eyes, wide and dark, seemed to seek answers among the stone effigies of the family crypt. No one dared speak of the question that hung between the mourners. Why had Joan died so suddenly, so young? In the years that followed, Charles II, soon to be known as Charles the Bad, would inherit not just his mother's crown, but also the tangled web of suspicions and unresolved grief she left behind. It is said that in his chambers, even after becoming king, he kept a small ivory carving of his mother holding a book. It was rumored to have been her favorite possession, yet it disappeared from the royal inventory not long after his ascension. There was, too, the matter of the monk from Castile. An inquiry was launched in the spring 1350. Letters were sent to the nearby monasteries and messengers dispatched. Yet not a soul had seen him. His chamber, when opened, revealed nothing amiss, save for an abandoned crucifix, its chain snapped, as though torn in haste. Among Joan's belongings, a single parchment was found, folded neatly within her prayer book. It contained a list of names, mostly minor nobles from Navarre and Champagne, but beside 3 names were marks in red ink. No explanation was given. The paper was dismissed by the court archivist as a list of correspondence. But when Charles reviewed it years later, he ordered the arrest of 2 of the men whose names bore the red marks. They would never be seen again. Thus ended the reign of Queen Joan II of Navarre, not with war or rebellion, but with a sickness that came and went like a storm over the mountains, leaving more questions than it answered. Her death is one of the quieter tragedies of medieval royalty, yet within its silence lies a tension that never truly faded. For in the world of thrones and banners, where crowns are inherited and loyalty is worn like a cloak, it is not always the loudest fall that leaves the deepest wound. Sometimes it is the quiet slipping away of a ruler whose promise had only just begun to bloom, whose presence was like the gentle rustle of pages in a library long forgotten. Sleep now, as the abbey bells fade into the hills once more, and the candles flicker low beside the tomb of a queen whose truth may yet lie buried just beneath the stone. In the hush that follows the passing of a sovereign, the world rarely stops. Duties press forward, and life, ever demanding, pulls the grieving back into its embrace. But some losses refuse to be swept away by the currents of time. They linger, like smoke from an extinguished candle, curling around the memories of those who remain. And so, as we move into the 20th part of our long and quiet journey, we find ourselves drifting further into the reign of Charles II of Navarre, Joan's son, whose own end would mirror the tragedy of his mother's, yet with a fire far more literal and cruel. Charles II, known by many as Charles the Bad, was a man of formidable intellect and cunning. He was born into a world of shifting alliances and cold betrayals, where the line between friend and enemy was often scrawled in ink and erased in blood. His upbringing, molded in the shadow of French politics and Navarre's independence, fostered in him a deep mistrust, one that would shape his rule and, in time, his undoing. In his early years as king, Charles displayed all the brilliance his courtiers had hoped for. He negotiated treaties with sharp precision, played French and English powers against one another during the 100 Years' War, and reasserted Navarre's sovereignty with relentless determination. Yet even as he fortified his kingdom's borders, he allowed bitterness to fester within. The court spoke often of his temper, quick to flare, difficult to soothe. His punishments were known to be severe, and his suspicion of betrayal bordered on obsession. It was said that he kept secret rooms within his castles, places where whispers were not permitted, and truth was often extracted by force. Yet none dared defy him openly, for his mind was unmatched and his wrath absolute. But by the year 1387, time had begun to erode the edges of Charles's power. His alliances were weakening. His body, once strong, had grown frail. He had suffered a series of minor illnesses throughout the year, which left him weakened and increasingly dependent on his physicians. At his winter court in Pamplona, the air was heavy with silence, and the once lively halls dimmed beneath layers of unease. It was during this time that a curious method of treatment was proposed. The court physicians, following a practice gleaned from Eastern medicine and long-abandoned Roman texts, suggested a full-body wrapping in brandy-soaked linens. It was believed that such a method would stimulate the body's warmth and draw out lingering humors believed to cause lethargy and weakness. The king, though wary, agreed. It was a cold evening in January when the ritual was to take place. The chamber had been prepared, the fire lit low, the windows sealed, the guards dismissed. A single physician and a young maidservant remained, the latter tasked with binding the king's limbs in the soaked cloth. The king was wrapped carefully, from shoulders to feet, his head left bare. The brandy, potent and aromatic, clung to the air like perfume. For a moment, there was stillness. No sound but the low crackle of the hearth and the faint rustle of cloth against flesh. And then, fate intervened. Some say the maid, inexperienced and nervous, sought to trim a loose thread from the cloth. Others say she fumbled with a candle, or even that a spark leapt from the fireplace itself. What is certain is this: flame touched linen, and in an instant the king became a torch. The brandy, so carefully applied, ignited with dreadful force. The chamber was filled with shrieking light and sudden terror. The maid screamed, fleeing in panic, as the physician attempted to smother the flames with cloaks and wet towels. But it was too late. By the time the fire was subdued, Charles II of Navarre had suffered grievous burns across his body. He lingered for several days, his skin blistered and raw, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. Those who were allowed to attend him described a scene of quiet horror. The once proud monarch now lay in pain too great for words. His eyes, though open, had lost their fury. In those final days, he neither cursed nor commanded. He simply stared, as if seeing something far beyond the vaulted ceiling of his chamber. He died not with the roar of a tyrant, but with the quiet resignation of a man who had seen too much, who had carried the legacy of a mother's mysterious end and bore his own death as a final act in a long, tragic play. It was said that his last words were not in Latin or French, but in the old Navarrese tongue, murmured so softly that even the attending friar could not catch their meaning. The court buried him in the royal abbey of Pamplona beside Queen Joan, his mother. Few mourned him publicly. His rule had been divisive, his actions often cruel, yet his death, so sudden, so violently ironic, shook even his enemies. For a king so steeped in suspicion, so watchful of threats, to be undone by cloth and flame seemed a twist written not by history, but by fate itself. In the years that followed, bards would sing of his passing with hushed tones. Some said it was justice, others that it was punishment from the divine. But the people of Navarre remembered. They remembered the firelight that night, rising from the palace windows like a beacon and a warning. Thus passed Charles the Bad, one more soul in the long, mournful procession of royal bloodlines marked by misfortune, a king wrapped in brandy and swallowed by fire. And in his tale, as in so many before, we find no glory, no triumph, only the echo of footsteps in a cold stone hall and the silence that follows after power fades. Now let sleep draw near, soft and deep, as the flames die low and the shadows lengthen, cloaking the past once more in velvet dark. The fire that consumed Charles II of Navarre left more than ash in its wake. It left behind a kingdom weary, a lineage bruised, and a memory that seemed to linger in the stone walls of every castle he had once walked. And yet, the thread of royal tragedy did not fray at his passing. It only wove deeper into the tapestry of medieval sorrow. As we drift now into the 21st chapter of our long slumbering tale, we travel north, beyond the Pyrenees and across the Channel, to a realm cloaked in mist and strife. There, another monarch would fall, not in fire, not by blade, but in the stillness of a garden, betrayed not by enemies, but by kin. It is England we arrive in now, in the year of our Lord, 1471. The Wars of the Roses raged across the countryside, a conflict of thorns and blood, where York and Lancaster tore at each other with a fury no banner could mend. It was a time when loyalty shifted like wind upon water, and the crown passed from one brow to another with unnerving speed. At the heart of this storm stood Henry VI, a king of delicate soul, soft voice, and a mind unfit for war. He was not like the kings of old who thundered on horseback or raised their swords in triumph. Henry was a man of quiet prayer, a scholar's heart beating in a realm ruled by iron and ambition. From the moment he took the crown as an infant, the shadow of misfortune followed him. His reign was marked by instability, rebellion, and devastating loss. Though crowned King of England and later of France, Henry's rule saw the disintegration of both realms. His inability to assert authority allowed the Duke of York, and later his son Edward IV, to challenge and ultimately overthrow him. Yet despite defeat and imprisonment, Henry survived, hidden away in the Tower of London, the fortress that had swallowed so many before him. By 1471, Henry's last hope had flickered. His beloved son, Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, had been slain at the Battle of Tewkesbury. His wife, the indomitable Margaret of Anjou, had been captured, and Edward IV had returned victorious, draped in the banners of triumph, to reclaim the throne and seal the fate of the House of Lancaster. Henry remained in the Tower. By all accounts, he was quiet in those final days. Monks who had once attended his chapel recalled a man who muttered prayers from memory, who sat long hours gazing through the narrow windows at the passing clouds. He had grown thin, pale as wax, his hair graying early under the weight of sorrow. He asked no questions. He received no visitors. Then came the night of May 21st. It was a warm night, unusually so for spring. The tower stood still under a veiled moon, its torches flickering low, as if reluctant to keep watch. The guards changed shifts, as they always did. The kitchens were quiet. No bells rang, no alarm sounded. And yet, by morning, Henry VI was dead. The official account, written hastily and with little flourish, stated that the deposed king had died of melancholy. A broken heart, some whispered, shattered by the death of his son. It seemed almost poetic. A king who had never truly desired power, undone at last by the grief that he had carried too long. But not all were convinced. The physician who examined the body, an old man skilled in the study of injuries, spoke only once on what he had seen. He described the look upon Henry's face as unnatural. Peaceful, yes, but not the peace of sleep. There was tension in the limbs, the mouth slightly parted as if startled in his final moment. And when pressed, he admitted there had been blood near the ears, a detail omitted from the royal report. The rumor spread quickly, carried in whispers through the court and across the churches. It was not sadness that had taken Henry VI, but steel. Some said it was the Duke of Gloucester, young Richard, brother to Edward IV, who slipped into the tower that night. Others believed it was done by hired hand, with a blow to the skull, clean and quick. No weapon was ever found. No confession ever recorded. And yet, the silence around his death was so immediate, so complete, that it spoke louder than any decree. The funeral was held with little ceremony. He was interred in Chertsey Abbey, far from Westminster, as though the court feared what his tomb might become. Indeed, years later, his remains were moved again, this time to Windsor Castle, his bones buried under layers of marble and denial. Yet even there, the memory of his life lingered. Pilgrims began to leave offerings at his tomb, convinced he had died a martyr. His prayers were said to calm the mad and heal the sick. The monks who tended the chapel swore the air near his grave grew warmer during prayer, and once that a single red rose bloomed by the wall in winter. And what of the tower? They say that on quiet nights in May, footsteps can still be heard along the lower corridors. Light ones, hesitant, as if a man in robes were wandering the halls, searching not for freedom, but for understanding. Thus passed Henry VI, a gentle soul in a cruel time, not with a crown upon his head or a sword in his hand, but with folded arms and a prayer half finished on his lips. He left no great conquests behind, no legendary speeches or lasting reforms, only the image of a king who wished to be a shepherd, but was born into a kingdom of wolves. Now let your breath grow soft once more, like the hush that fell upon the tower when morning came and the world turned onward, never fully knowing what passed behind its stone walls. The hour is late, and the past grows still again. The moon wanes gently over the ancient battlements, and the hush of centuries settles once again upon the path we've walked together. In this, the 22nd and final chapter of our story, we turn now to the farthest reaches of medieval legend and courtly intrigue, where sorrow does not come with thunder or flame, but with stillness, and the soft rustle of betrayal cloaked in silence. Here, in the closing act of this twilight journey, we meet a queen not killed by war nor felled by illness, but undone in secrecy and shadow. Her name, Isabeau of Bavaria, still lingers faintly in the halls of French memory. Isabeau came to France in the final years of the 14th century, a bride chosen to marry Charles VI, the young and promising king of the Valois dynasty. She was 17, with flaxen hair and violet eyes, fluent in her German tongue, but little else of the world she would soon govern. The court welcomed her with gilded ceremonies and pearls, and the people, wary but watchful, looked upon her with hope. And for a time, that hope flourished. Charles and Isabeau were well matched in youth, their marriage initially marked by affection and the birth of many children. The queen embraced her new homeland, learned the language of court, and carried herself with poise, even as the weight of ceremony pressed heavily upon her shoulders. But the shadow of misfortune had already begun to take root. In 1392, only a few years into their union, King Charles suffered the first of what would become many devastating episodes of madness. While journeying to Brittany, he drew his sword suddenly and struck down 4 of his knights, crying that traitors surrounded him. The court froze in horror. The physicians, confused and uncertain, offered only leeches and fumigations. The king would recover briefly, only to descend again, each time deeper, into delusion and confusion. With the king unfit to rule, Isabeau was drawn into the eye of power. She sat in council chambers, signed decrees, and fought to protect the fragile crown of her children. But her authority, while necessary, was resented. The dukes of France circled her influence like wolves, each vying for control over the mad king and the regency. The queen's position became precarious. Accusations whispered through the palace halls that she was unfaithful, that she had grown too close to the Duke of Orleans, Charles's brother. The people, frightened by famine, plague, and instability, turned against her. Her Bavarian roots were scorned. Caricatures of her, cruel and obscene, were painted upon city walls. The German woman, they called her, the whore of France. Still, Isabeau endured. But the war with England pressed harder. The 100 years of war grew ever bloodier, and the French nobility splintered. In 1407, the Duke of Orleans was assassinated, murdered by his rival, the Duke of Burgundy. The realm fractured further, and Isabeau was caught in the storm. Over the years, her influence waned. Her son, the Dauphin, rejected her. The English invaded. Paris was seized. And in 1420, Isabeau, weary and embattled, signed the Treaty of Troyes, an act which disinherited her own son in favor of Henry V of England. It was, in the eyes of many, treason. She disappeared from the public eye soon after, retreating into quiet exile within the Hotel Saint-Paul, once a royal residence, now a fading echo of courtly grandeur. There, behind shuttered windows and crumbling tapestries, she lived out her final years. Her letters became infrequent, her attendants fewer. And though the wars continued and kings rose and fell, she was slowly forgotten by all but a handful of loyal scribes and chambermaids. She died in 1435. No grand procession was held. No abbey bells were tolled in her name. The woman who had once ruled France during its darkest years passed from the world without pageant or poetry. And yet, there is a haunting quiet in her ending. Some say she died of illness, perhaps a wasting fever, perhaps something slower and less visible. Others say she simply stopped, that she laid down one evening, closed her eyes, and chose not to rise again. Her body was interred without honor in the convent of the Celestines, though her tomb was later lost to time and war. But her story, in its melancholy arc, endures. A queen who tried to hold a kingdom together as it crumbled around her. A mother who bore the hatred of a nation, not with defiance, but with endurance. And a woman who, at the very end, met death as she had met life's most bitter trials, not with fire or steel, but with silence. Isabeau's life is a final whisper in the long dirge of medieval royalty, a song not sung aloud but murmured beneath the breath of history. No glory awaited her, no justice found her, yet in the stillness of her passing, there is something deeply human, a truth untouched by crowns or courts. The quiet suffering of a soul who tried and failed and endured. So now, dear listener, as the final candle burns low and the last breath of wind passes over forgotten tombs, let your own spirit rest. You have walked with kings and queens, through battles and betrayals, across time's slow corridors. Let the sorrow of their ending soften your heart, and the hush of sleep wrap you like the velvet of night. Close your eyes now. The tale is told, the voices of the past grow still, and peace at last returns.